tell the story because I have since published in AMR. It took me a lot longer than when I was a PhD student. And I think I've learned a lot along the way about what not to do to embarrass yourself. But I want to preface this by saying neither Jen nor I nor anybody else can tell you this is the way to get published, because I'm not going to speak for them. I still get rejected. I was hanging out with Jeff McMullen last night. He just got rejected by JBV this week. He's the editor of JBV, so just in case, yeah, okay. So I just want to make sure we all know there's no magic formula, that we all are flawed in our work, and that every study published in any journal is flawed in some ways. So the question is not how to write the perfect article or how to guarantee acceptance at whatever journal you're striving for. The question is, how do you increase your odds of getting that R&R, and then what do you do with the R&R once you have it? So I'm now a field editor at JBV. I'm on a couple of editorial boards. I review, as do these folks, for a lot of other journals, and shockingly you see the same thing across the board. So here's my sort of 4 quick and dirty what you need to do. Number 1, get your ideas out there early. It's not a pop quiz, it's okay. Early and often at conferences. Talk to people at conferences about what you're thinking about writing before you invest hundreds of hours in writing. Have you noticed when you have to express your ideas to other people, you get better at expressing them? Right? When you actually have to articulate, especially if you call mom, hey, what are you working on now? How's your little paper? Yeah, that dissertation. It's doing great, mom, that little paper. But you might have to explain in normal language what you're doing. That can help you understand the practical implications of what you're doing and why. It's important to get your ideas out there early. It's then also important to get your writing out there and let people read it before you submit it to journals, even if you've won Best Student Paper Awards, apparently, and to be open to that feedback. This afternoon, all of you will have a senior scholar give you feedback on your papers, right? Are you prepared to defend what you've written, or are you prepared to change what you've written? How many of you are prepared to defend? How many of you are prepared to change? And I'm going to tell you, you need to do both. It's not just change, because sometimes in the review process you have to push back against reviewers and say, with all due respect, what you're asking me to do is not the intent of my paper. So you need to defend a little, but you also need to be open to change, because if you're just trying to convince them why what you're already doing is perfect and you didn't already get the acceptance, you're not going to get the acceptance. So you need to be open to feedback, but also prepared to defend. Know your audience. This was the hardest thing for me as a junior scholar, is understanding which journal is looking for what kind of paper. And part of that is having other people that have published in those journals read your papers. Part of that is by looking at your reference list. Have you guys heard this advice before? If you've written a paper, go look at your reference list and do a count of which journals you cite how many times. I just got invited into a paper that had an R&R at a journal, and one of the things the reviewer said is, you don't cite our journal. And I looked at their reference list. I had not been part of the project, and they cited JBV 27 times. They had 27 JBV papers they were using to build their arguments, and it was not under review at JBV. And I'm like, this doesn't make any sense. Who are you talking to? Who's your audience? Who are you trying to have a conversation with in the field? And if that conversation is happening in ETP, then you should be submitting to ETP. If the conversation is happening in JAP, you should be submitting to JAP. You need to understand where the conversations are going on. How do you do that? You read. How do you do that? You look at what you're citing. How do you do that? You get ideas from other people about what you're doing. And then the last thing I'm going to say is to the fancy car. Do any of your dissertations have limitations? Does anybody have anything that you think you might not have done perfectly? I see 2 hands. Seriously? Okay, let's be honest here. All right. The biggest pet peeve for me and what I've seen from reviewers is people that try to hide their limitations. They hope reviewers won't see them. If your reviewers don't see your limitations, they're not doing their job. They are supposed to find your limitations. So the best practice, in my opinion, is own your limitations. Yes, we recognize we have this super fancy context that's shiny and different than every other context. Here's why that may be a problem, but here's why we think it's actually an advantage. Own it, talk about it, instead of trying to cover it up and hide it and hope for dear God that they won't notice it. Right? Just be honest about your scholarship. All of our work has flaws. Dean Shepard, who was the editor of JBV for a very long time, is one of the most prolific and wonderful scholars I've ever met in my career, says every paper is flawed. It's a matter of which ones have more benefits than flaws. Those are the ones that get published. So those are my quick, dirty comments. We have a lot more that we'll talk about as we go through the session. All right?
Thank you for the opening remarks.
Okay. Now you guys have to work.
Okay, Phil and I have prepared 4 vignettes for you guys to go through. These were all papers that eventually got accepted, so we'll always get what we think are completely unreasonable comments or unprofessional comments by reviewers, right? So I think those two, you can address how you deal with unprofessional comments or unreasonable comments, which I leave there. But let me pull out these vignettes which we've prepared for you. Phil's runner is this clicker, so I have to go off, excuse me, as I do this. We did 4 vignettes for you, right? I leave this up so that you can take notes if you like, and because some of these are actual quotes, so I don't want to distribute them, right? And some of these which we have tried to mask. Reviewers seem to disagree for different reasons, and there's scholars from different domains that speak to this, right? And here are reviewer 1 and reviewer 2. I would like each of you to go through the process of how do you think you would address this or think about this, and then discuss this in your groups, and then we'll come back to the panel and you can share your views. But I'll go through the 4 vignettes with you first, okay? But I'll leave this up for 30 more seconds so that you can read it one more time. Let me click to the next slide. And this is collect more data, do more work, where the reviewers want more of this. And the editors seem to sort of agree, but also seem not completely agree, right? So the key thing is at the conceptual level, right? What does it mean at the conceptual level? Right? And also it's not the reviewer's duty to tell you what study should be, right? You should run the study, you should do this. Right? They are not here to write the paper or do the paper for you. How do you do it? May I click to the next one? And most of the things to do with position and framing. Okay, perhaps we give you 10 minutes in your groups to go through these 4 vignettes and tell us how you would address them if you were going through the review process. And if you want anything pulled up, I can pull it back up so that you can see this, right?
Reviewers, thank you so all of you.
Only one so.
I think part of what we discussed is that it really depends on the dominant literature that we're trying to address. And if the authors are really trying to bring both of these literatures together, saying to the reviewers that they highlight an interesting tension where one literature illustrates something that they found to be true and other contrary. So this particular study is addressing that tension. So that might be one approach. Or the other approach, if an audience, again to your point, if we're trying to speak to a particular audience, really pay attention to just that literature's audience that we'd like to do, and maybe defending one and changing the other in terms of one reviewer or the other. So I guess it depends on the audience.
Other thoughts?
Yeah. We echo our neighboring table. We literally were thinking the same approach.
So is reviewer 1, is their comment positive? He's saying you're not producing anything new. Like, we already know this, so who cares? Right? And reviewer 3 is saying this is contrary to theory. So you clearly have a cool data set that you found some results in and you're trying to figure out how to justify it, but it doesn't make any sense. So neither of these, in my opinion, are good comments, right? I mean, these are potential death knells, right? Do you think this shows well?
I do, and my concern would be, with that first suggestion of saying, well, reviewers, we're actually only targeting the other literature, so we're just going to work over there. the concern there, you know, as an editor would be, well, you're going to lose that reviewer, for sure. You know, so on that next round, that reviewer who you're saying, well, we don't really care about your literature, they're going to be, well, then I don't really care about your paper. Reject, right? So you need to get a little bit more creative with your response. So just not to embarrass you, but just, to be upfront and to let you know what's likely to happen if you were to adopt that sort of strategy, which I think your team was leaning towards as well. That would be the huge risk. You don't want to lose any reviewer through the process at all, right? You want to keep them all on board, or obviously tip them over onto your side.
So perhaps I can ask a follow-up question. If you get this as editors, what is your role and how would you handle reviewers speaking different voices completely?
To me. So I think your comment about the tension between the different predictions that different bodies of work would predict is one way to frame this. To say, we really don't know what we expect to happen because what seems obvious in one literature is contradictory in another literature. We want to resolve that tension by looking at both frameworks, proposing hypotheses from both perspectives, and then seeing what bears fruit in our particular context. Right? That's one way to frame it, but you have to do so in a way that makes it interesting and engaging for readers in both of these literatures so that you don't lose the reviewers.
Yeah, absolutely. What I had written down in response to vignette number one, and neither Melissa nor I have seen these vignettes either, just so you know, okay? So we're just reacting on the fly very much like you are, but we just have, X more years in the field than you do.
So my question related to that, if we come up with a new set of hypotheses, how do we present that to reviewer 3 who's already saying ex post rationalization?
You're absolutely right. We went back to the literature on product development and learning and made sure we were properly grounded in the expectations scholars in those areas would have. This is the BS part of the writing that you already got to. So much. Thank you so much. As a result, we've revised our hypotheses to be consistent with our understanding of both literatures. We've added some moderators to integrate them in a more robust manner. Please see pages blah, blah, blah for our revised theoretical development. Because that's what you need to do. So tell them what you did.
One more
At
and
the
we can
back there,
switch.
yeah.
So would you say for the reviewer one's comment that, okay, we understand that these two are well understood in the grammar literature, and we say that these are the basis of our hypothesis, that we put the base hypothesis, but then hypothesis 3, 4, and 5, if we have any more, are the novel ones. Would that be the idea?
You could do that, although they might still not feel that they were fully heard. So you might just want to embed sort of, the first set of arguments that they say are well understood. Just build that into your argument. And then when you're writing up your results, you can talk about the support that you found for your baseline expectation or baseline premise, but the real interest is what you call your hypotheses.
Vignette 2.
Let me shift to Vignette 2. This was one of the papers Phil or I was the handling editors at Whichway, and largely our reaction was along the lines the editors have been saying, along this. This wasn't one of our papers, but could I actually go to Vignette 3 first? Because it's central to all what we do and it's best for us to spend as much time on this. So take a couple of minutes and how you would address this, and they would, because I'll also take copious notes.
I'm going to tell you, this is the #1 paragraph of every editorial decision I write for JBV. Every single decision, rejection or R&R, has to do with your contribution at a conceptual level.
Yeah.
Every single one of them.
Absolutely.
So solve it.
If you unpack it for us, it would be great.
How many of you in your PhD programs have had your faculty talk to you about this point right here? Awesome, so you're ready to solve this for us. This is good. What do you do when the editor says this?
So we're thinking 2 responses. One is to obviously thank them for their feedback and say, we can understand why you would think that we can make a contribution, and after looking at your responses, we can see how we can we weren't explicit enough about it, so here's what we were really trying to put forth, and here's why we believe it's still a contribution.
Okay.
Or here's the contribution that we didn't, state clearly in the paper.
So explain it better.
Explain it better.
Okay?
Or
Yeah.
change. Say, you know what, we absolutely agree, after looking at your responses.
We're going to go to a different journal that doesn't require theoretical contribution.
We think that there is a better theory to ground this in and then propose what that might be.
Yeah, I got a similar kind of statement in my recent program, and the way I'm planning to respond to this is to show that in my findings and my analysis work, I should probably argue more for why my findings have been good.
All right, red flag. Let's be real deal, red flag. What you just explained was an empirical contribution. My data is contrary to the expectations in the literature. Very interesting empirical contribution, not a conceptual or theoretical contribution.
No, I didn't say to argue for my opinion.
Based on your results, though. You need to have, if you're submitting to a journal that requires a theoretical contribution, you need to have a theoretical contribution before we ever know what your data says. That's an empirical contribution. That could be one of your three. I have three contributions in my work: theory, theory, methods. Theory, theory, cool data set. At least one, if not two of the three, in my opinion, needs to be a theoretical, conceptual contribution before I ever know that your results are contradictory to what we would expect. You might say the theoretical contribution is examining boundary conditions for extant theory, and maybe there's something specific about your context that would suggest opposite outcomes from what theoretical basics would suggest. That's a contextual condition, that's a boundary condition, that's a theoretical contribution. But just saying my results are different, that's an empirical contribution. I don't say that to be critical, I say that to give everybody understanding of that, because that is what happens a lot, is we get back to, but my data is really cool. Nobody's looked at this in an Indonesian context. Nobody's looked at that. That's interesting, but it's not a theoretical contribution. Do you agree?
Absolutely, yeah.
Just make sure I'm not on the limb here by myself. So I'm not sure. All right.
There's another comment from that, too.
Yeah, other comments? I guess it also depends on whether you want to theory review, because then you get the requirements for technology and pilot. Compared to your testing, because then the requirement is that you have to share that for testing fields that have not been tested before. So I guess in those two situations, you receive this kind of comment and you are trying to come up with new concepts and they're not new at all, so that would be a bigger problem.
So this speaks to knowing your audience in terms of the journal you submit to. JBB requires theoretical contribution. JBI does not. You guys familiar with Journal of Preliminary Insights? Replication studies or phenomenon-driven studies. No theoretical contribution needed. AMD, Academy Management Discoveries, is now phenomenon-driven. No theoretical contribution needed. So if that's the kind of work you want to do, and there's great value in replication studies and extension studies, those are the kinds of outlets for them. But if you're shooting for the JBB, ETP, AMJ, JAP, sort of one to hold up on whatever, depending on your context, then you're going to need a theoretical contribution. Even if you're doing inductive work where the theory comes out of your data, you still need to have a reason to explain what theoretical advancements you're anticipating making by collecting that inductive data. Okay, so more suggestions on how to solve this one. This one's huge. This one's still one I work on and struggle with as an author. Okay.
Yeah, in our book we discussed that we can probably have a guideline and thing saying that these are the questions that has been previously answered by this particular theory in other papers in the literature before that exists. And then we pick up one of those three and we say that, okay, this is how we either challenge or change or advance. We're not going to go out with them, we're going to say one of these things. And then we're going to say that, okay, probably this is how our theoretical development is addressing these questions that has not been answered by the previous field. And that may challenge, that may change the way we were thinking before theories were proposed. Or maybe that is just advancing, like what has been done, and this is an additional thing that is not being answered by the theories.
Okay. Gentlemen at this table, I'm sorry, I can't see your name tag right here. You said you're taught 3 paragraphs. What are they?
Well, there's a fourth, but it's a roadmap.
Yeah, I don't care about the roadmap. Give us the-
What we know, what we don't know, and why we care.
Yeah.
And
So,
that told us the default was, there's a gap because nobody cares. Explain to us why there's this gap.
that's the key. Yes, exactly what you said. Here's what we know, here's what we don't understand. But you've got to go that third step to say why we care. Nobody studies this, well, because maybe it's not very interesting. Nobody studies why we have black tablecloths at conferences. Did anybody even notice? Yeah, well, I mean, it instrumentally matters whether it's black, purple, or red. Probably not unless you're having a wedding, right? So you have to explain, what are we not understanding? What are we not getting? What are we not able to help entrepreneurs do if we don't study whatever it is you're going to study? Why do we care?
I'm really glad that you said two of your contributions to be here. I don't know that I've heard.
It depends on where you're submitting to.
One of the questions that keep coming back to me from advisors and different people is that what new kinds of questions can be answered as we're trying to set this up. So what does this help us answer
Yeah.
that we haven't been able to answer before?
Yep.
And obviously we're not, if we get that, we're not expressing that very well.
Another little rubric or whatever they're called that I found helpful, and I think it stems back to a paper from Davis way back in 1971. I don't know if you're asked to read that anymore in your, some nods in your doctoral training, but that's interesting paper,
I
right?
used to hate that paper.
I love it. Now
I
I
hate that
get
paper. It took me 10 years to understand.
Oh my gosh, I love it. I think it's great, and I think in terms of math with it, in the sense of, if the field is saying X, and if the field thinks they know X, well, wouldn't a really cool paper be the one that says, oh yeah? You think you know X? I think, it's 1 over X, or, X prime. Or at least it's 1 over X or X prime under these conditions. And let me tell you a story about why I think that. Or not a story, let me give you an argument for why I think it's 1 over X under these conditions. That's one of those really provocative papers. And as you were saying, not every paper can do that, the challenging the received wisdom. But some can. And if you come across an idea for that, I would encourage you to go for it, because that's the one that the reviewer typically goes, oh, that's cool, that's interesting, hadn't thought of that. And you might actually get them to be a little defensive, and then they're engaged, right? And then if you're able to convince them, that reviewer is probably likely to be much more on board, even though you might have been challenging their X, but at least it's interesting. And then if you can't do that, then at least trying for the all right, well, at least I'm going to do like an X plus 1, or, X plus Y, or something like that, type of paper. But I would encourage you all to think about the X prime type approach if you can.
Really, the question is, why are you studying what you're studying for yourself? Why is it interesting to you? What were you reading when you came up with your dissertation idea that made you go, yeah, this is garbage. I think it's this instead. And if you can articulate that in a non-condescending way to those previous authors, then those folks are going to say, hey, that's interesting in contribution. So really, it sort of stems from, why are you studying what you're studying? What makes it intrinsically interesting to you? And is there a story there that will help you come up with your conceptual contribution? And it could be, my data says something opposite of what the theory says, but why? And if you can get to the why and build that up front with the theoretical why, boundary conditions, moderating conditions, whatever that is, contextual factors, then that makes it much more exciting. Right? We think this is universally true, we find out it's only true under these conditions. Those kinds of things really push the field forward. Other suggestions, questions, comments on this?
I have a comment, because it seems like we all know this Manta, this prayer, this and we still, all of us struggle with that.
Yeah.
Is there a different way to practice being clearer rather than just writing and torturing editors? If there's a way to make that message clearer, to learn that up front.
Yeah. So there's a really great book written by Ann Huff called Writing for Scholarly Conversation. that I recommend. She was a management, still is, I think, management scholar. And she talks about what happens when you write. And the analogy is to a cocktail party. So you're all going to the social tonight, right?
Yes.
When you go to a social in a crowded room of people you don't know very well, do you just barge into a group of people and join the conversation and say something? Or do you sort of wander around the room and listen in, and listen in, and listen in, and then when you have a conversation that sounds like you might be able to talk to those people, you step in, you listen for a while, and then you say something new, not just repeating what the guy next to you just said, you say something new. So this is a beautiful analogy for how we should be writing contributions. Who is sort of whispering about what you're writing about? What are their whispers saying? Which of those conversations do you want to pick up the threads from, product development or learning or both? And then once you fully understand what they're already talking about, what can you add to the conversation that makes them want to stay in that little social group and keep talking to you instead of go, oh, it was nice to meet you, Nicole. Right? So it's simple to think about. It's a lot harder to do. But I think the idea of thinking about if I were going to write a paper that I wanted Dean Shepard to read and go, ooh, what does Dean write about? What do I need to find different, interesting, novel, unique about what I'm writing about? And then how can I frame it in a way for Dean, Holger, Nikki, whoever's writing with Dean, not just one person, you're writing for a community, that would make them go, that's interesting. And I'll take it a step further. If you have an opportunity to interact with any of those people that are part of your writing audience, you should be doing that verbally, right? You should be going up to them tonight, scary as that may be, and saying, hey, I want to tell you a little bit about what I'm doing and see which parts of this resonate for you, right? I don't even know if Dean's at the conference this year, but he's my best example because he's a super nice guy, right? But to think about if you're writing and you're citing all these names and you can't put a face to the name, or you can't think about, is that a real human being behind that name on the paper that I'm citing? And what would they care about what I'm writing? That's the trick that you need to give yourself. If you were talking to that person, Robert Barron, whoever you're talking, what would you say? Hey, Robert, affect's important in entrepreneurship. Would you say that to Robert Barron? He would be like, yeah. Right? But if you said, hey, Robert, your ideas about positive affect being bad, I found that only works when whatever. He would go, really? Tell me more. So that's what you're trying to get as a reviewer, an editor, and ultimately readers of your paper once it's published to say, tell me more. I read your intro. I want to read the rest of the paper and understand more about what you're trying to accomplish here. That's the goal. The other recommendation is Tim Pollock and Adam Grant, I think, have publishing an AMJ. That series, if you haven't seen it on how to publish an AMJ, is brilliant, and the lessons there apply across journals. And I usually cite I think it's Grant and Pollock paper on setting up your introduction, and that's really where your contributions come into play.
Is that the one about the 5 C's? The 5 C's of setting up an introduction? There's one of those from the editors in AMJ, and it's a 5C framework. Yeah, for positioning your work, and it's really great. I'm blanking on who the authors are, but if you type up 5C framework AMJ from the editors, I'm sure you'll come across it, because that's what this boils down to a lot, right? Is that introduction. And what a little trick that I still do, 20 years later in this field, is when I'm writing that introduction, I will try to find an introduction in the journal that I'm submitting to. It has to be in that journal, and I usually try to find one that's not on the topic that I'm writing about at all. And but it's an introduction that I like, that I find incredibly compelling, and I put that in front of me in my first little rainbow of papers. I'm very old-fashioned. I still have all the actual hard copies, and it's right there in front of me when I'm writing my intro, and I analyze that introduction, not for the substantive content, but from the perspective of how are they hooking me in, okay? And then I try to write my intro almost using some of their verbiage, but then putting in my substance, right? And I kind of give it a try like that. I found that to be a good crutch throughout the years, just to at least get started.
Is it usually a Hamburg article that you have? Some of the ones you like to
Do you know what some of your exemplars
Are
are?
there particular authors that you like to model sometimes?
Are any of you inductive scholars?
No.
Qualitative? So Aaron Powell and Ted Baker's work, whether it's AMJ or SQ, they set it up just beautiful. I'm sorry, but they just write the structure of how they structure articles is gorgeous. It really is. I'm not even trying to suck up to Ted. He's not even.
Should we move on to scenario 3? Or that was 3? Go back to 2 or?
Let's go to 4.
You wanna go to 4?
I think this is more straightforward.
Okay.
And if we go through this a little bit quickly, we can also give you time to say what are your concerns and comments about the review process that our panel can then address. So we go through this a little quickly, please, so that you get time to ask about your questions.
Although I find this one the same as the last one.
This is the 4th one.
No,
Yes,
the same
similar.
answers,
Yes,
right?
yes.
It's framing and
Yes,
contribution.
yes.
You're one, so
Okay.
say that we'll do a 3. And that's why.
I'm loud. I'm loud. I'm used to large classes. I'm loud. What can you tell us to answer this scenario that is different than what we were just talking about?
Yeah, this is where you tell us.
Because we're not sure.
Hold them early again. Let's see how it works.
One of the things we discussed is maybe they thought you were meandering a little bit in the first two paragraphs. You needed to tighten those up, condense that, and get to the
Yep.
Yeah.
So get to the point.
So, and we were wondering if maybe there was too much acquiescence to all the reviewers, instead of, picking the best one and then defending that to the other one.
Yep. What else? Yeah.
So we decided that regarding the second point, you should just cut to introduction and you don't argue and don't fight a dead battle, just make introduction as long as they want. But regarding the first point, we a little bit puzzled and kind of question. So perhaps what happened is that during all the rounds of revisions, you kind of lost your voice because you were following all these recommendations, and finally it got so blurred because 3 people were telling you what to do.
Yep.
And it's actually a very tough situation because it's probably not the first, not the second round review, I think these days. So could you write like closer to your original version probably,
Or maybe a better 3rd, 4th version rather than go back to version 1 when you've gotten this far. I often write this in my conditional accept letters to authors. I'll write something like, you finally got the story in a good place, but you're a little bit meandering because you've gone too far towards the reviewers. I want you to go through the whole paper one more time and make sure your voice is in it and make sure your voice is consistently through it and tighten and shorten and all of those things. Because you've added a paragraph here, you've added a paragraph there, you've added something about your methods because they've asked you to defend. To your point, now it's time to streamline. So if you can proactively try to streamline as you're revising rather than waiting until that conditional accept stage, your reviewers will love you. I'm going to call Jen out really quickly on something. She was a reviewer for me on a manuscript, and she wrote in the response to the authors, it would be really helpful if you gave much more concise responses to the reviewer and editors because the response document was 65 pages long. And the manuscript was 45 pages long, and it was like, I agreed with her and I said, yeah, you are exhausting your reviewers.
Yeah.
Just think about what they have to read. Yes, you want to be thorough in your response letters, but if there's some huge explanation, put it in the response letter, don't put it in your manuscript so that your manuscript stays tight and concise. And they will come back and say, that was a beautiful explanation in your response document, put that in the manuscript. Right? I've seen that happen, where people have said, I love how you wrote that, now we want that in the manuscript, because they know you know what you're doing. But don't belabor things to the point where they just can't get through your response doc, much less the manuscript itself. If you're asking somebody, remember this is voluntary, to read 100 pages, to decide whether they like you enough to give you another R&R, that's asking a lot. It's asking a lot. How often do you like to read 100 pages that your faculty advise you? Yeah, okay. So that's one of those things. Keep your voice, keep it as tight as you can. If you need a lengthy explanation, put it in the response, not in the manuscript. Other thoughts on framing and shortening and tightening? I'm going to say something that's a little bit taboo. I have hired copy editors in the past to help me tighten my manuscripts. Usually, twice it's happened, I've gotten to a 3rd round of review at a journal, and the reviewer continues to say, there are minor grammatical mistakes. Make sure you hire an English language copy editor. And I go,
I'm a native English language speaker and I'm a bit uptight about grammar. I'm a little bit of a grammar freak. But if that reviewer is not convinced, I will pay the $300 or whatever it costs me to hire the copy editor so that I can say to them, thank you for your suggestion. I hired a copy editor. Hope you like it. I say it a little bit more nicely than that without the snark, but it is, a lot of people think it's a bad thing to do. You don't want to hire somebody to edit your ideas, but it is appropriate in our field to hire people to help you streamline the way in which you write, or if you are not a comfortable or native English speaker, either or both, it's certainly an appropriate thing to do, and it is not taboo. In fact, the Academy of Management now has a link on their website to a copy editor. And in case you haven't been there before, when you actually get an acceptance at any of the Academy journals, you then go through multiple rounds of copy editing with their copy editor. This shocked me the first time I went through that process, because you've been through 7 rounds to get the acceptance, and then literally 3 more rounds with the copy editor.
Yeah.
It's brutal.
Perhaps for the last 10 minutes, we turn to you and you can voice what are things, specific challenges you are facing or a specific comment that you can do with advice. The floor is yours again.
I would love to hear you kind of riff on how you do your response letters, because I've seen so many different versions of that. To me, that's as much an art as writing.
Right. I think what's really key there is not to do that superficial, Brad Pitt approach, right? Of the whatever the table was. Oh, thank you so much. This is the most insightful comment we've ever received, or whatever, right? I think what's really key is actually, this is probably going to sound obvious or whatever, but really trying, they might have gone on for this long of a paragraph in their comment, right? Really trying to weed through and really get out the kernel of what their main point is. It's probably going to be buried in there somewhere, and that skill of being able to get to that and almost disregard all the other stuff, because as long as you're able to send the signal that you've invested the effort in trying to get to the crux of their concern and really grapple with that, I think that's what's going to impress them much more. So that would be my starting comment there, is really to actually spend a lot of time on thinking through what is their real main concern here.
I've always taken the approach of writing a response to reviewers as if I was talking to them out loud. And we usually don't grovel out loud. Right? So really appreciate this comment because it helped me think through what our causal mechanism was, and you're right, we did not properly explain it. You suggested these papers for us to go read. We went and read them, and here's what we pulled out and we thought it's a dialogue, right? This is something I did not appreciate early in my career, was your revise and resubmit process is a dialogue. It's a conversation with the reviewers and with the editor. And so if you treat it as a conversation, respectful, polite conversation, but not a suck up grovel situation, and not repeating copious amounts of your manuscript in that response letter. Really, because if you're repeating entire blocks of text, like a sentence or two, we've explained this on page 12 of the manuscript, for example, give me a sentence or two, maybe, but please, and most of the editors now will say, do not repeat copious amounts of your text, because that's how your response documents go. So it's really a matter of having thought through what they're trying to communicate, whether they're saying it well or not. When you first, I heard from Donna over there, when you first get that letter, all you want is whiskey to go through it and read it, I think is what you said? Yeah, okay, I heard that. Yeah, you did say that. Yeah, when you first get it, you're going to be like, they're idiots, they don't understand me, how could they not see the brilliance of my writing and my amazing insight, and of course you're going to have that reaction. Over time you get a little bit thicker skin and you learn a little bit of sort of displacement from that. But I do recommend you read it and then you put it away. You got an R&R, woo, that's awesome. And if you didn't, you got some great feedback, that's awesome. Put it away for a day or two and then come back and think about, okay, whatever they didn't understand is because I did not communicate it effectively and I need to communicate it more effectively. And then look at it, again, being open to that feedback, defending what you are doing, but also saying, maybe they're right. Maybe their suggestions are going to make my manuscript better.
I usually need a week or two, or maybe even a month or two, rather than just a day or two. And I think as I need the time, to get it embedded in my subconscious, right? And just, not be obsessing about it rationally. Just let their ideas, their suggestions sort of sink in, and let the creative connections form a little bit more.
And you're going to find the way that works for you. If you haven't yet, you'll continue to revise on it. And as you work with different co-authors, you'll find different styles of how you write letters and how you deal with responses. My pattern is I write the response to reviewers first, and then I revise the manuscript. I'm promising them what I'm going to do to address their concern, and then I better deliver the manuscript. Some of my co-authors are like, that's backwards. Okay, it works for me, it doesn't work for you, let's talk about that as the co-author team. But really, these are the different people have different ways of approaching and dealing that makes more sense to them. Sometimes if you spend all this time on the revision and then you go back to write your response doc, you reread it a month later and go, that's not what they asked me to do at all. Why did I do that? Like, I interpreted that differently. So you need to iteratively work both.
Another question? Yeah.
Some of the professors I work with have very different approaches to writing papers and entering the review process. Some want the paper to be perfect by the time they submit it and really polished and everything. Other just write it up in broken English, send it to a copy editor once, and then basically submit it 3 weeks after getting started on the paper to test the water with the reviewers. That, of course, gives them a lot of leeway to pivot in the process and to work with the editors and accommodate them later on. But it might also test the patience of them. How do you go about this?
And burn the opportunity, right? If you get a rejection, you can't go back.
Right.
Yeah. I would personally not take that risk. Whenever I send something out, I always think it's, my perfect baby, look at it. I just wouldn't take the risk. I think what you're trying to do, even though we all know it's not perfect and we know it's going to morph quite a bit through the review process, I think what's really important is that you're trying to signal as best as you can that you know what it takes to get published in this journal. So you want to send out a product that's signaling that, because trust us, on this side as editors, most of what we receive from the reviewers is mixed feedback. It's typically, it's so rare that all 3 reviewers are going to say accept, even in later stages. And it comes down almost invariably to a judgment call by your handling editor. So you want to be doing whatever you can to signal to him or her that you know what it takes to publish in this journal.
The only time it's consistent is when the advice is reject, reject, reject.
Yeah.
Honestly, I've never had an R&R go out where all 3 said revise. At least one is usually this fatal flaws and blah, blah, blah. And so that's the editor's discernment to say, okay, calm it down. Let's see if there's a potential nugget there. I'm probably in the middle. I don't wait until it's perfect. I shouldn't admit that, should I? Once I get to the point of we're making incremental improvements, we've revised it as best we can, but really we could sit on it another month and make this much more progress in it. It's not worth that month of time to me because of just time commitments and opportunity costs. I'd rather get it out as long as there's nothing that I think is going to be fatally or substantively changing the story. If I'm still refining the story, the contributions, I'm going to keep working on it and not send it. But once the story's down, the data's down, the analysis is down, it's got to go because I need to know what's going to happen. If I'm spending the last 2 weeks or month perfecting the last 3%, why, when you know 20% is going to change in round 1 of the revision process, right? But that's, again, very subjective.
Perhaps the last question.
What's the best way to respond to it when you're said that you don't have a control variable or something, you've already collected all of the data and there's no way to go back to get more data, but yet they say this should have been included?
What a brilliant suggestion. We put that in our limitations and opportunities for future research. I mean, I've actually had editors say in letters to me on my papers, we recognize you can't deal with this. Like your reviewers, and this to the second vignette, sometimes reviewers want more data, and the editor will signal to you whether they want you to go with the data or not. And the other thing, my last sort of closing comment to you is I never knew when I was sitting where you are, and until I became an editor, that you can actually pick up the phone and call an editor and ask for advice during the revision process. I always thought it was a very arm's length, hands-off process. And since becoming an editor at JBV 4 years ago, I will have authors that will email me or call me and say, hey, we're thinking about collecting a new data set or not. Here are the pros and cons, we'd like your input. So that is a very legitimate thing that you could do, is email the editor and say, listen, we are not able to go get this new data. Is this something that we should not bother with the revision because we can't win over that reviewer, or should we move forward? And your editor should give you some kind of signal.
I would save that though for only like big picture concerns. So you don't want to be sort of back to my response to that. You want to still be signaling that you know you have what it takes. You know what it takes. So you don't want to be troubling your editor with like a small comment about should we include this control variable, or not?
Yeah.
Like big
not every
picture
little
stuff.
detail,
Yeah.
big stuff. Yeah. If you're two paths, you're not sure which way to go with the revision. It's not a 20-page email. Not an hour-long phone call, just a quick check-in with you. Their goal is to put good papers in their journals, right? Your goal is to write good papers and get them in their journals, so this is consistent.
That does bring up a really important question about, since none of the journals now are like hard copy, what's the limitation as far as like, we can only accept so many since it's electronic? Or is it just to keep it really,
They're not all electronic. Many of them still publish print versions, particularly for library holdings.
I see.
And it's a contract between a journal and the publishing house on how many pages get filled and don't get filled.
May I thank Jennifer and Melissa for taking the time and also really insightful comments. Thank you both. Thank you, and see you at the social.